In November of 2004, inside a glass-walled conference room on the Nokia research campus in Espoo, Finland, an engineer set a prototype on the table. It was the size of a deck of cards. A full-color touchscreen covered its entire face. It could browse the internet on a cellular network. It had a built-in camera, and it ran on a system that a team of Nokia engineers had been quietly building for nearly 4 years. In the room were Nokia's head of R&D, several middle managers, and the engineer who had led the project. He walked them through what the device could do. He had prepared a business plan. He was asking for production resources. The meeting lasted under an hour. The project was killed. 3 years later, almost to the month, Steve Jobs held up an iPhone. This is the story of how the largest mobile phone company in the world looked directly at the future of mobile phones and decided, in a room with a working prototype on the table, that it wasn't worth building. It is not a story about stupid people. The engineers who killed that prototype were not incompetent. Some of them were brilliant. The reasoning they used was, by the standards of 2004, entirely defensible. It was also completely wrong. And the way they got it wrong, the specific logic, the specific institutional pressures, the specific afternoon when the decision was made, explains not just what happened to Nokia, but what happens to almost every dominant company when it encounters the thing that is about to destroy it. To understand what was lost in 2004, you have to understand what Nokia was in 2004. This was not a company with ambitions to become big. It had already become the biggest mobile phone company on Earth by a margin that is difficult to convey today. At the peak of its dominance, Nokia controlled over 40% of the global mobile phone market. In some European countries, the number approached 70. Every third phone sold on the planet was a Nokia. The company's revenue was so large that it represented approximately 4% of Finland's entire gross domestic product. Finland had, in effect, become a country with an enormous phone company attached to it. And Nokia was not just a hardware company. It had the best supply chain in the industry, built over a decade of brutal optimization. It had the strongest distribution relationships with every major wireless carrier in Europe, Asia, and the Americas. It had an operating system, Symbian, that it had helped design and now controlled through a consortium arrangement. It had dedicated manufacturing plants on 4 continents. It had research laboratories in 15 countries. It had 45,000 engineers. What it did not have, what no company in the world yet had, was an answer to the question its own internal researchers were quietly asking by the early 2000s. What happens when the phone stops being a phone? Inside Nokia, in laboratories in Espoo, in Tampere, in Oulu, there were teams asking exactly this question. They had been asking it for years. The company had a long history of what is sometimes called futures research. Groups of engineers with loose mandates to explore what mobile devices might eventually become. These teams had produced, since at least the late 1990s, a steady stream of concept devices and prototypes that were, by the standards of their era, remarkable. In 2001, Nokia engineers were testing tablet computers with cellular connectivity, essentially an iPad, 9 years before the iPad existed. In 2003, they released the Nokia 7700, a touchscreen phone with a web browser. That particular device was canceled before it reached mass market. A revised version, the Nokia 7710, launched in 2004 with a full touchscreen, stylus input, and mobile browsing. Technically, the 7710 worked. Commercially, it sold poorly, fewer than 1 million units against Nokia's typical volumes in the hundreds of millions. But behind those products, the ones that reached the market, were projects that did not. Engineers inside Nokia were building prototypes with capacitive touchscreens, the kind that respond to fingers rather than stylus pens, before Apple had shipped one. They were designing application frameworks that would have let third-party developers build software for Nokia phones. They had working demonstrations of multi-touch gestures. They had concepts for app stores before anyone in the industry had used the word. Some of the technology they built in 2003 and 2004 was, by any honest reckoning, what would later be called the iPhone. And most of it was killed in meetings that nobody at the time considered particularly dramatic. The meetings where these projects died were not arguments. Nobody shouted. Nobody was wrong in any way a reasonable executive could have pointed to and refuted. The reasoning, in every case, followed a pattern so consistent that former Nokia engineers have described it in near identical language in interviews conducted years later. A prototype was demonstrated. The engineers showed what it could do. A discussion followed about what it would cost to bring to market. The costs were always high. Developing a new operating system, retooling factories, retraining the sales force, renegotiating with carriers who were used to selling keypad phones. The revenue projections were always uncertain. Nobody knew how many of these devices would sell. And then, without exception, someone in the room asked a specific question. What happens to our existing business if this succeeds? The answer was always the same. A successful touchscreen smartphone would cannibalize Nokia's existing product lines. It would eat into sales of the keypad phones that were generating almost all of Nokia's revenue. Carriers would have to be renegotiated with. Factories would have to be retooled. The entire optimization that Nokia had built over a decade would have to be broken and rebuilt. And the market was not asking for it. Consumers were buying keypad phones in record numbers. Nokia's market share was growing. Why exactly would the most successful mobile phone company in the world disrupt its own business to build something that nobody was yet demanding? In every meeting, the answer was the same. It would wait. It would watch the market. It would be ready to respond when the demand emerged. What Nokia was doing in those rooms is what every dominant company has done in every industry at every hinge moment in the history of technology. It was optimizing for the market that existed. And the future, by definition, belongs to products that serve a market that does not exist yet. Steve Jobs walked onto the Macworld stage in San Francisco on January 9, 2007, and held up a device that Apple had been building in secret for 2.5 years. The first iPhone, touchscreen, full internet browser, no physical keyboard, no stylus, a single home button, and everything else happening behind a pane of glass. Two things happened inside Nokia that afternoon. The first was that engineers in laboratories across Finland began messaging each other. Many of them were watching a live stream of the presentation. Many of them recognized what they were seeing, the form factor, the interaction model, the architecture. They had seen versions of this before, in their own laboratories, on their own workbenches, and prototypes they had themselves built and watched die in meetings. The second was that Nokia's senior leadership issued a response. Olli-Pekka, who had become Nokia's CEO in June 2006, addressed analysts. He said Nokia had superior technology, deeper carrier relationships, better supply chain economics, and thousands more engineers than Apple. Nokia would respond in time. There was no reason for panic. Anssi Vanjoki, Nokia's head of multimedia devices, gave press interviews explaining that while the iPhone was an interesting device, Apple was a computer company. It did not have the supply chain to scale phone production. It did not have the carrier relationships. It would struggle to reach meaningful market share in mobile. Both men were, by the standards of the industry in January 2007, making entirely reasonable observations. They were also, in ways that would become clear within 18 months, wrong about almost everything that mattered. The number of iPhones sold in 2007 was small, 6 million units in a global market of over 1 billion handsets. Nokia's market share that year, approximately 38%, was more than 50 times Apple's. The thesis that the iPhone was an interesting but marginal product, destined to occupy a premium niche while Nokia continued to dominate the mainstream, looked defensible for most of 2007. The thesis began to break in 2008. The iPhone 3G launched in July of that year. It was cheaper, faster, and available on more carriers. Apple had done something Nokia's executives had not anticipated. It had rebuilt carrier relationships by offering carriers something they had never had before, a device that consumers would pay premium prices for and that drove unprecedented data consumption on wireless networks. By 2010, Apple was selling over 40 million iPhones per year. Google had launched Android in 2008, and the Android ecosystem was growing faster than iOS. Samsung, which had laughed Android out of its boardroom in 2004, was now producing Galaxy phones that ran Android. The mobile phone market, which Nokia had dominated for over a decade, was restructuring itself around a product architecture Nokia had seen in its own laboratories and declined to build. Nokia's market share collapsed in stages, from 38% in 2007 to 29% in 2009, from 29 to 21 in 2010, from 21 to 12 in 2011, from 12 to 3 by 2012. In September 2010, Nokia replaced Kalasvuo with Stephen Elop, a Canadian executive who had been running Microsoft's business division. In February 2011, Elop sent every Nokia employee a memo that would later be called the Burning Platform Memo. It compared Nokia's situation to a man standing on an oil rig that had caught fire, watching the flames climb toward him. His choice, Elop wrote, was to burn or to jump into the freezing water below. Nokia, he wrote, had to jump. What Nokia jumped into was a partnership with Microsoft. The company abandoned Symbian. It abandoned its own operating system development. It committed to building phones running Microsoft's Windows Phone. The logic was that Windows Phone would become a competitive third ecosystem alongside iOS and Android, and Nokia's hardware expertise combined with Microsoft's software would carve out a defensible market position. It was not enough. In September 2013, Microsoft announced it was acquiring Nokia's phone business for $7.2 billion. The acquisition closed in April 2014. Microsoft took over the factories, the patents, the manufacturing relationships, and approximately 25,000 Nokia employees. 15 months later, in July 2015, Microsoft announced that it was writing down $7.6 billion in charges related to the acquisition. The write-down was larger than the original purchase price. Microsoft was not only acknowledging that the Nokia phone business was worth nothing, it was acknowledging that the process of integrating it had destroyed additional value. Billions of dollars of it. The Microsoft phone division was effectively shut down over the following 2 years. Thousands of former Nokia employees were laid off. The factories in Finland, which had once produced the most sold mobile phones on Earth, were closed or sold. Finland lost, in the span of about 5 years, the company that had represented 4% of its economy. The Tampere Technology Museum in central Finland contains several of the prototypes that Nokia built and chose not to ship. Some are visible to the public. Others are in storage, cataloged but not currently displayed. Among them are the touchscreen devices of 2003 and 2004, the tablet prototypes from 2001, the multi-touch concepts from the mid-2000s. The software frameworks that were designed to let third-party developers build applications for Nokia phones. Frameworks that were killed because the carrier model Nokia relied on did not allow open app ecosystems. There is a particular kind of visitor to that museum. Former Nokia engineers, some of them now in their 60s, who come to look at things they built decades ago. What they tend to say, in interviews after their visits, is not that Nokia was stupid, it is that Nokia was reasonable. Every decision to kill a prototype in its moment made financial sense. Every choice to defer disruption, to wait for the market, to protect the existing business. These were not mistakes by any standard that existed in 2004. They became mistakes only in hindsight, when the alternative was no longer hypothetical. There is a lesson in this story that is often missed. It is not that Nokia's executives were dumb. They were not. It is not that they lacked imagination. They had more imagination than most companies. The prototypes in the Tampere Museum are evidence of that. The lesson is about a specific kind of institutional blindness. A company that dominates a market cannot, by the structure of its own incentives, be the one that disrupts that market. Every pressure inside the company, every career, every bonus, every supply chain, every factory, every carrier contract is optimized for the current business. The future, when it is still the future, is always cheaper to postpone than to build. Nokia's engineers saw the future. They built it on their workbenches in laboratories in Espoo and Tampere. They brought it into rooms and set it on tables. And then, meeting after meeting, they watched it get killed for reasons that everyone in the room at the time found perfectly convincing. That is the real story of what happened at Nokia. Not a failure of vision, a failure of institutional courage, which is something much more common and much harder to solve. If you made it this far, you already know this channel isn't for everyone. It's for people who want the part of the story that doesn't make it into the business magazines. The meetings where the future was decided by people who didn't know that's what was happening in the room. If that's you, subscribe. The next story is about a different meeting. Summer of 1976, Northern California. A 21-year-old walked into the office of his former boss and offered him 1/3 of a company that did not yet exist for $50,000. The former boss said no. The company was called Apple.